The interview that everyone from Hillary Clinton to the White House staff to other forces in the corporate media told us would be an unrequited apologia for Vladimir Putin actually turned out to be an interesting discourse on history, politics, economics, philosophy, religion, and culture that very few corporate journalists today would even be able to approach in quality that was undertaken by Tucker Carlson. So before I get into the content of this interview and before I discuss my thoughts, because I sat and watched all 2 hours and 7 minutes of this Vladimir Putin Carlson interview, I must say that every thinking person should realize that, should consider why in the world have so many institutional forces in society try to poison the well before the water could even be drawn. Why in the world do so many forces in American society try to smear Carlson's character, try to attack Carlson, try to make him out to be some kind of Putin puppet, all because he dared to do something that was, in this current circumstance, extraordinary and rather unorthodox for an American reporter to do during wartime? I have absolutely no idea beyond the fact that perhaps they wished to keep the narrative surrounding certain geopolitical events contained within a certain rhetorical frame that gives life to the agendas of people who operate in that frame. This is not conspiratorial thinking, this is geopolitics. Geopolitics is not conducted by measure of sound debate and political philosophy. Geopolitics is conducted by measures of force, by measures of power politics. Who do you know? How do you know them? What can they do for you? Resources, GDP, currency valuation. All of these things matter more in geopolitics today than any kind of sound philosophical thinking matters. So to look at this kind of interview and to see just the depth that was achieved in this interview, regardless of whether you agree with Putin's conclusions or not, I'll get to that in a second, it was rather astonishing, it was remarkable, and it was refreshing. A few general observations before I get into some of the nitty-gritty content. It's evident to me that Vladimir Putin is a very intelligent man. It's also evident to me that in his pursuit of intellectualism, he has studied history to a significant extent, so much so that his perspective, especially on the cultural heritage of the territories that are now Ukraine, is influenced by a deep quest through history. Whether it's right or not is not what I'm talking about. But it's influenced by a deep quest through history, then pulling all these historical events together to present his own narrative, his own sort of framing of those events to justify himself. A lot of world leaders will generally appeal to the authority of some international body. They'll appeal to popular consent. They'll appeal to some kind of rhetorical nicety that substantively doesn't really mean that much, but optically looks good and lends artificial credence to their worldviews or to what they're trying to do, and they'll act on that basis. What did Barack Obama say when before he was going to go bomb Libya without congressional approval? He said, "I don't need you. I don't need Congress. I have the UN. I have NATO." That's basically, I'm paraphrasing, that's basically what he said. So a lot of world leaders don't tend to think in these very broad terms. And it should also be something that noted that Putin himself said that Russians think more about the eternal and the West is more pragmatic. Now, I don't agree entirely, but I think he's hitting at something that is very important, that in terms of Russia and Russians and how they perceive their own culture, they have a much more uniform and clear cultural identity that is rooted in a strong connection to the land and history versus some other Western countries, although I believe the West also has a strong history that unifies it and a strong core of values that unify it. And that's why I believe Western civilization is a moral force for good in the world. But unfortunately, some of the institutions in the West are not moral forces of good, and they taint the West and bring it down. Different story, different day. Let's get into this. So, one of the first things I recognize in the interview is that Putin, his going through history, because one of the first things he does, because Carlson asked him, "Why are you invading Ukraine? What are you doing?" And to Carlson's credit, he pushed Putin and he made sure to get an answer. And there were several times that Putin tried to evade and it seemed like he was trying to evade, or he was trying to go into these long tirades. And Carlson always brought it back to basics. Watch this.
Чтобы вы не думали, что я что-то придумал.
So that you don't think that I'm inventing things. I'll give you these
Я вам
documents.
отдам вот эти документы.
Well, it doesn't sound like you're inventing it. I'm not sure why it's relevant to what happened 2 years ago.
Но все-таки
But still,
документы из архива.
these are documents from the archives, copies.
Здесь письма Богдана
Here are the letters from Bogdan Khmelnytsky,
контролировал власть в этой
the man who then controlled the power in this part of the Russian lands
в Варшаву.
that is now called Ukraine.
You see, he brought it back to basics, and he said, no, let's stay focused. And to Putin's chagrin, Putin was a little bit saying, well, do you want an actual conversation, or do you want to talk shit? Like, what do you want? So there was a little bit of tension, but this tension actually helped refine the overall quality of the interview, because quality is only achieved through fire. It's through refinement. Fire is a symbol for refinement. And so I think that was what's happening in this interview. But the first question asked was, why are you doing this? And Putin goes through this long history lesson that goes on for 15, 20 minutes, it felt like 30 minutes even. And he then brings it back to present day and uses that to justify why he's doing what he's doing in Ukraine. And all I could think about when I was hearing him is how the tension between property rights, historical connection, and political legitimacy. I think that Putin's initial opening salvo raises important questions about how to trace property rights through history and connect them to current governments and legitimize those governments. Because Putin's argument is that the areas of Ukraine were always, and still are, fundamentally Russian vis-a-vis the culture and vis-a-vis historical events that impact the culture in those areas. But the question becomes, how do you go from a cultural connection to then a political connection over the course of time? If we accept that, for example, that political states require individuals to form them, and if a culture is going to establish a political state, it requires also individuals to form that as well, and it requires heritage, it requires a bunch of things. How do you tie legitimacy to a political state all the way back through history, when throughout history the governments of that particular area have changed, the dominion of that particular area has changed, the philosophy of that area has changed? It's very hard to establish nationhood or ownership or property rights in a particular area solely on the basis of cultural heritage, because cultural heritage does not imply ownership. But perhaps if more people were willing, perhaps one of the great geopolitical questions could be, what role does cultural heritage and traditional ownership of land play in the legitimacy of a government? The problem is the geopolitical order is not informed by that consideration. That consideration requires an understanding of the nature of man, because property is very simply a result of the principles of human nature that necessarily requires individual ownership in order to be enacted and in order to establish a baseline for justice in society. So that requires a conversation about human nature, conversation about philosophy, about justice and sound government. The UN, the Atlantic Council, NATO, China, all these organizations and people aren't interested in having those kind of conversations. Putin seems interested in having not exactly the same kind of conversation, but something in the approximation of it. But these people are not interested in having that kind of conversation. And because of that, because they want to rule and push geopolitical order by means of force and power politics and manipulation and resources and currency, you don't actually get to have these rich explorations that help add color to the world and help inform these sort of international decisions better. And so I noticed that, and I thought that it's very interesting that we should pursue that line of thinking. And if the West really wants to repair from the damage done by these unhealthy institutions that have been pushing it into so many areas of the world, alienating people from those areas of the world, bombing people without just cause, all kind of things, we should really look back at our roots and go back to basics and ask ourselves, okay, how can we establish the legitimate state by means of evaluating cultural heritage? It's a very interesting question that I think that this interview kind of explores, not enough, but it kind of explores and lays on the table. So that was a very good question. I think that Carlson asked, and he pursued it in the right way. Putin said something that was very interesting to me. I will play a bit of this clip. He said that he believes that agency heads undercut cooperation with Russia. So the story goes that, according to Putin, Russia was trying to have a mutual missile defense compact with America. And the president at the time, George Bush, was willing to hear it. But then Condoleezza Rice and a few others, and the CIA director came over to Russia under the Bush administration and said no. So he argues and contends that the agency heads within the Bush administration actually shut down opportunities for greater cooperation go.
I was told it was very interesting. I said, just imagine if we could tackle such a global strategic security challenge together. The world would change. We'll probably have disputes, probably economic and even political ones, but we could drastically change the situation in the world. He says yes, and asks, are you serious? I said, of course. We need to think about it, I'm told. I said, go ahead, please. Then Secretary of Defense Gates, former Director of CIA, and Secretary of State Rice came in here, in this cabinet, right here at this table. They sat on this table. Me, the Foreign Minister, the Russian Defense Minister on that side. They said to me, yes, we have thought about it. We agree. I said, thank God, great. But with some exceptions.
So twice you've described U.S. presidents making decisions and then being undercut by their agency heads. So it sounds like you're describing a system that's not run by the people who were elected, in your telling.
That's right. That's right. In the end, they just told us to get lost.
Now, here's what's interesting. I don't doubt his claim, because this is how this works. The establishment of the State Department and the military-industrial complex and the administrative state relating to the military is deeply entrenched into the structure of American government. And these are oftentimes the people who, when rubber hits the road, make the consequential decisions. Now, of course, Bush was a part of that whole establishment. He wasn't separate. And if Bush really did say, we'll consider it, my suspicion is not going to be that he actually meant it. Maybe he was just paying lip service to appease Putin in that moment, and then later on, he said, guys, go ahead and cut this off. But the point is this. Agency heads subvert presidents all the time. It happened to Kennedy even. In fact, after the Bay of Pigs, Kennedy was so mad at the CIA that the CIA made it a point to basically say that we have to get rid of Kennedy. That was basically one of, the vendetta of the CIA director at the time was like, we had to get rid of Kennedy. He's no good. He's bad. And his military advisors turned against him. This has happened in many courses of time. President Trump dealt with the same kind of thing. And it's not because the presidents were disagreeable whether or bad. It can be. But more often than not, it's because the agendas of those that actually staff the White House and fill the structure of government are not in sync with A, what the president wants, or if it's in sync with the president wants, B, not in sync with what's morally and philosophically sound for the country. Obviously, peace with Russia is morally sound for America because it does not, it takes our citizens out of economic danger, out of military danger, out of a lot of different kind of situations that otherwise impede our quality of life. And Putin kind of mentions later on in the interview that the sanctions have actually hurt America because they have. What happened after America imposed the sanctions on Russia? Inflation, supply chain crisis, gas went up. A lot of bad things happened, and it's only just now stabilizing, kind of, sort of. There are still permanent effects from what happened. Because sanctions violate economic law of transaction and voluntary trade, and whenever you do that, you can expect your economy to have some significant consequences. Anyway, so I'm not surprised that there are forces within the government that are pushing against peace with Russia. It's been happening for decades. Even during the Cold War. Decades. Although, I'll give Reagan credit. Reagan did collaborate with Russia quite a bit. Khrushchev. And he did his best, I think, to maintain a certain level of respect. It was Putin and Russia that said, okay, no, it was Reagan and Russia that said, okay, neither of us are going to be the ones to launch a nuclear weapon in response to the other, because they understood the damage that would do to civilization. That takes a level of respect to go against the great evil, as it was called, and say, even though we disagree ideologically, I'm not going to be complicit in the destruction of humanity. And they said, neither will we. That's the kind of cooperation America had when it was most tense with Russia. Why can't it have that now? That's the question that we should all be asking. So Putin then mentions Ukraine and talks a lot about how he does not believe that America should have involvement with Ukraine, that it has nothing to do with them. He even asks, what are you thinking? What are you doing? Go.
I do not understand why American soldiers should fight in Ukraine. There are mercenaries from the United States there. The bigger number of mercenaries comes from Poland, with mercenaries from the United States in second place and mercenaries from Georgia in third place. Well, if somebody has the desire to send regular troops, that would certainly bring humanity to the brink of very serious global conflict. This is obvious. Do the United States need this? What for? Thousands of miles away from your national territory. Don't you have anything better to do? You have issues on the border, issues with migration, issues with the national debt, more than $33 trillion. You have nothing better to do, so you should fight in Ukraine? Wouldn't it be better to negotiate with Russia?
Now, again, this is another case of Putin very clearly speaking the truth in this case, not because he's Putin, but because it's just the truth. The truth is, and I've maintained this for years now, America's first moral obligation on a geopolitical level and a domestic level has to do with what directly helps and benefits the American people. You cannot show me how these endless foreign wars, especially in Ukraine, which has drained hundreds of billions of dollars from the Treasury Department at a time when we have our own crises at home that cannot be funded quite properly, that has caused supply chains and all kind of other things to get worse, that has caused sanctions to go into place. You cannot tell me that this has a manifest benefit for America beyond the geopolitical language of containing Putin or stopping Russia from attacking a sovereign nation. Well, guess what? Those are geopolitical justifications meant to push a certain vision of geopolitical order that has absolutely nothing to do with the security, health, and preservation of the American state, and everything to do with the security, health, preservation of NATO, Atlantic Council, UN, and these other organizations that were birthed from the post-war consensus after the World War II that seek to uphold a certain geopolitical order that at the time seemed plausible. Who would want another Hitler to arise? This seems absolutely ridiculous, but as time has gone on, has been used by bad interests to pervert sound concepts like the liberal international order, which basically just said, let's all cooperate economically and not trade bombs. Let's trade money instead of bombs. But what happens is you get countries that hijack this order and then use it for their own gains. China changes the rules and changes and does underhanded trade manipulations, and they get away with it. And then all of a sudden, people are like to sit and work, and all of a sudden that single vestige that defined the post-war consensus comes shattering down in the minds of men because it was manipulated by people that didn't actually have the first principles and the philosophy and the values needed to maintain that system. The post-war consensus is one of the most disastrous things 50 years on, 60 years on, that could have happened to the West. At the time, it made sense, I'll admit. But it did not account for how bad interests that occupy these institutions could use it for so many different nefarious purposes. War on terror, Cold War, so many things. NATO expansionism, which is a thing, by the way. Bombing Libya, funding Gaddafi, giving him CIA training, then bombing him into smithereens. Funding Hussein, giving him CIA training, bombing him into smithereens when he gets out of line. So, the problem is, though, Putin's objection only makes sense in a world where American interests and the first principles of the geopolitical interaction, which should be what benefits your nation, actually matter. In a world of globalism, and in the world of the abstract world citizen, in a world of geopolitical interests of institutions over the domestic interests of your citizens, what matters not is what helps the country. What matters is what helps the idea of the country in the context of world events that are being dictated by certain forces. People talk about the BRICS coalition. Okay, they're a force, but so is the UN, the Atlantic Council, and NATO. Both of these forces have an interest in perpetuating themselves, even at the expense of their own member nations. That's how this game works. Does Putin recognize it? Well, maybe. The endorsed of Eurasianism that he has seems to indicate so. But still, he has this, and this is one point of the interview that actually kind of got me. Putin has this flawed perception of, at least he says he does. We can't trust anyone says, by the way. You can't trust what Joe Biden says or Putin says. You can't trust him. Always have a grain of salt whenever you're listening to any world leader. But Putin has this perception that we can enter a state where security concerns are traded and world cooperation is possible. The problem is you can't do that from a top-down perspective. The problem with geopolitics is that it's been directed from a top-down perspective and engineered by certain forces that have interest in seeing certain things like war continue. That's the problem. So Putin kind of mentioned that he wants to have a top-down perspective to ensure order and predictability. These are his words. Amongst the world. Well, for an authoritarian mind like his, that makes sense, but to a mind that is educated in the things of proper human conduct, who understands how this works, it makes no sense, because you can't have dynamism and freedom, which really give nations life, and also make global cooperation easier if they're adhered to by both parties and not manipulated by one party. You can't have those two things and have a top-down centralized approach to world peace. You can't do it. You can't get into entangling alliances and then say we want to have world peace. No, you can't do it, because the human spirit is dynamic, and there are a lot of different people on the planet that have different agendas and different goals, and some who are willing to kill for them. And you have to be willing to recognize that and deal with that where it may arise. It's very simple. But he also makes a comment about, he says that's a comment about hemispheres, right? He says the brain is divided into hemispheres, but man should be united in his security interests. But again, this is not realistic. And unfortunately, I don't think it's going to work. But what can work is if the countries of the world say, we're not going to care about what the EU has to say about our own sovereignty or what the UN has to say about our own sovereignty. We're going to look at our interests. We're going to evaluate them on several bases, on an economic basis, on a cultural basis, on a social basis, on a philosophical basis, and we're going to make decisions on that basis. And we'll cooperate, of course, but we'll do so on our terms, not on the terms of some bureaucrat at an institution somewhere. That's the feasible method, the feasible system that is the alternative to the current system that we have right now. And that's probably the system that I agree with, because it's more America first than anything else. So Putin then goes on to say, he goes on and pursues this line of things being stable and predictable, and goes on to endorse the regulation of AI. It's interesting. So AI, he contends, it is a threat to humanity, which I think it can be, absolutely. Not necessarily, but it can also be a great boon to humanity. But I have a lot of people that know me, watch my channel. I have a lot of questions about AI. I have a lot of questions about the dissolution of the boundaries between the digital and the material, and what that could do to our ethical thinking and our political thinking and our moral thinking. Because if our ethical thinking is based off of what occurs in reality, if your reality is transposed by a digital space, your entire idea of ethics changes, then your politics changes, then your perception of humanity changes, and then you as a person changes because your conduct is now being informed by something that's not real. But so in that sense, AI can be a massive threat to humanity. But Putin seems to believe that AI is a threat to humanity because it is unbridled in uncontrolled development. And this reflects the top-down authoritarian mind of Putin. Right? I've given him some credit, but this kind of reflects his old world mentality that advancement and progression, if it's to remain safe, must be centralized and controlled. That's just not the case. The moment you centralize AI is the moment you give people that are, in many cases, will be unaccountable to other people. Right? You remove it from the social context, you put it in the political context, and it can now become a tool for whatever that person wants it to be. What do you think CBDCs are? Right? The moment you take digital currency, which is a positive good for society, when it is decentralized and is a Bitcoin, and you make it into a central bank digital currency, you've just ruined it. And you've put it in the hands of people that are not going to be accountable and who could use it and who will use it for political ends as opposed to the ends of advancing humanity within moral limits or constraints. So centralization does not equal good, nor does it equal sound. But I do think that it's very important that we talk about how AI is going to impact society, and I think that it was very good for Tucker to bring that up and talk about that. Last observation I want to make. I'm kind of glazing over everything here. There's a lot more, but this is what stuck out to me. Tucker asked about the jailed Wall Street Journal reporter. Watch this.
I just got to ask you one last question, and that's about someone who's very famous in the United States, probably not here, Evan Gershkovich, who's the Wall Street Journal reporter. He's 32, and he's been in prison for almost a year. This is a huge story in the United States, and I just want to ask you directly, without getting into the details of it or your version of what happened, if as a sign of your decency, you would be willing to release him to us and we'll bring him back to the United States.
Мы столько сделали жестов доброй воли, что, мне кажется, мы исчерпали всю линию.
We have done so many gestures of goodwill out of decency that I think we have run out of them.
Ни разу не ответил. Но
We have never seen anyone reciprocate to us in a similar manner.
что мы
However, in theory, we can say that we do not rule out that we can do
не
that
исключаем того, что мы можем это
if our
сделать
partners
при
take reciprocal steps.
встречном движении со стороны наших
When I talk about the partners, I first of all refer to special services.
представителей специальных служб.
Special services are in contact with one another,
Определенные условия, которые
but there are certain terms being discussed via special services
по
channels.
партнерским каналам между спецслужбами.
I believe an agreement can be reached.
So typically, I mean, this stuff has happened for obviously centuries. One country catches another spy within its borders, it trades it for one of its own intel guys in another country. I think what makes, and it's not my business, but what makes this difference is the guy's obviously not a spy, he's a kid. And maybe he was breaking your law in some way, but he's not a super spy, and everybody knows that. And he's being held hostage in exchange, which is true. With respect, it's true, and everyone knows it's true. So maybe he's in a different category. Maybe it's not fair to ask for, somebody else in exchange for letting him out. Maybe it degrades Russia to do that.
This just shows to me that the fears of Tucker making this a puff piece are not true. To basically go towards a man that has absolute authority in Russia and say, you are holding an American citizen hostage, let me take him, takes a gutso and a temerity that very few people have. I'm not even sure that I would have been able to ask that. I would have been a little bit frightened. But that takes gutso and temerity, and that reflects good on the character of Tucker. Because Tucker is very critical of the narrative, the dominant mainstream narrative, but he is still willing to recognize common humanity when he sees it, and he is still willing to recognize the common Americanism we all share. So, and he also is probably willing to recognize good journalism too, or a journalist in general. So even if that person, as Putin said, was doing espionage, Carlson believes, he was a reporter, he was providing information, our foundation in America is freedom, bring him back. That's very bold, and it kind of sealed the interview for me, and it kind of showed me that this is a really enlightening way look into how Putin actually thinks. Not presumption, not filtered through the State Department, not filtered through our diplomatic institutions, but hearing it from himself. It's very fascinating. It's very important. So my takeaways are very simple. I think more Americans should be willing to think for themselves, consider these issues for themselves, and in the process of doing all of that, they should also be willing to embrace an independent mindedness towards their own institutions. Our diplomatic institutions are not the core of our nation. They're not the character of our nation. They are structures that happen to be in our nation that are sometimes manned and powered by people that are not supportive of our nation. This is the case for probably the diplomatic institutions of any country. But with that in mind, we cannot have a blind trust towards institutions. We must have an allegiance towards truth, and Tucker did that, and good on him. My friends, I love you guys so much, and stay pensive. Bye, guys.